The afternoon held a brightness that did not match the weather inside my ribcage. I stood at the sink with water running over a glass that had done nothing wrong, and I felt the kitchen change shape around me. News arrives in many costumes. On that day it wore soft fabric and carried a sonogram print as if paper could bless anything it touched. My wife Harper said we were having a baby. I have wanted to be a father since I learned to tie my own shoes, and felt a sense of ceremony. Yet the timeline sitting behind her smile refused to hold still. I work as a field investigator for insurance claims. My job trains the eye to follow sequences until they admit what really happened. In the weeks before the announcement, there had been patterns. Late nights that needed new names. Receipts that did not belong to our rhythm. A laugh that sounded edited when it reached me from another room. I did not speak the word no. I did not accuse. I asked for water and handed her a glass and fixed my gaze on the way light bent inside it. She kept talking about names and paint colors as if a room could be lectured into innocence. There would be time for walls later. First, there needed to be time for facts. I said that I would support what was true and protect what was ours, and that I needed to do two things in the morning. The first thing was to set a meeting with counsel. The second thing was to arrange a DNA test conducted through a laboratory that understands chain of custody. I used calm words and a steady tone. Calm is not a lack of feeling. Calm is a leash on a large animal inside the chest. She froze and then heated. She brought up old pain and used it as a smokescreen. She brought up one hardship and used it as a stage light. She asked if I was calling her unfaithful. I said I was calling the science that binds fathers to children by its correct name. I reminded her that our history included a low motility result from years back. The doctor had said that conception for us would likely need help. Harper had chosen to say we would be the lucky exception. I chose to say that exceptions are rare by design. If this child was mine, I would spend my life proving worthy. If not, we would need to move through daylight rather than through a theater. I moved every conversation from that night forward into the written word. If she wanted to speak about money or appointments or paperwork, it would live in text or email where timestamps behave and memory does not get to play director. I slept poorly. The house slept too. It breathed the way buildings breathe when wood shrinks and settles after long heat and sudden cool. Morning arrived on schedule, and my plan walked into it with shoes on. I called Petra, an attorney who had guided a friend through a disaster without turning the road into rubble. She answered with a voice that lets tired people stand up straighter. I told her the facts and left speculation out on the porch. Harper had announced a pregnancy. A sonogram with a date lay on the counter. My gut knew what it knew, but I wanted the science to speak without me whispering hints into its ear. Petra asked measured questions. How far along? What medical practice? Have you signed anything? Did you move money recently? Do you intend to remain in the home? Do you want the marriage to survive if the child is not yours? I answered each question as if I were filing a report after a long drive. She said we would proceed in 2 lines. Health and law. Health meant a DNA test conducted under chain of custody, not a kit you mail after a moment of drama. A formal process in which identification is verified, samples are collected by a trained technician, and custody is documented from hand to hand so that a court can accept the result without squinting. If Harper refused during pregnancy, we would set it up after birth, and we would make sure the hospital knew my intention not to sign any document that named me father until science did. Law meant a plan for assets and a plan for narrative. She would draft letters requesting records and notices that would discourage any attempt to trap me with a signature made under pressure. She would prepare a petition to disestablish paternity in the event that needed to be filed seconds after a result arrived. She would also draft a request for a constructive trust on any marital funds used to support an affair. There would be no shouting. There would be paper that carried weight and did not leak. I thanked her and wrote the appointment time in my calendar with a dot instead of a flag, because flags pretend to be exciting. I called a laboratory that holds people to standards and booked an intake for the following week. I asked what documentation they needed, and the answer sounded like music to me. Identification, paperwork from counsel authorizing the test, a clear understanding from all parties that results would be released to counsel first. I emailed Petra, and she sent me a letter that fit in a single page but felt like a wall. Bring this to the lab, it said. Bring only this. Leave complications at the door. The days that followed behaved like an exam room clock. The minute hand moved faster when I stared. At work, I walked claim sites and took photos of hail impacts and checked attic joists for fractures and noted the difference between cause and coincidence. In the evening, I cooked simple food and let the stove make a steady argument for patience. Harper shifted between sweetness and pity and fury, as if trying on coats in a store that had a sale with no end date. She started buying baby items with the card tied to our joint account. Diapers, a designer bassinet that looked like a small boat, a weekend at a mountain resort with a spa package labeled prenatal. She left the receipts on the console near the door like trophies. I scanned and filed each one under a folder that would one day speak in paragraphs. I did not announce that I was scanning. Announcements are performances. I was not auditioning for a role in her play. The lab sat inside a building that believed in glass and order. The intake specialist had eyes that had watched people reach for dignity and fail. She treated me like a person who might not fail. We reviewed identification and paperwork, and she explained the process slowly, without condescension. If the mother consented during pregnancy, we could test using a non-invasive method that analyzes fragments of fetal DNA in her blood along with my sample. If she refused, the plan would wait until after birth, when a simple swab could be taken from the child and from me under supervision with chain of custody. I signed what I needed to sign, and then I left without looking over my shoulder because looking back suggests a wish for a different road. My road needed fewer wishes and more steps that carried their own weight. I told Harper about the appointment by text, not as a request, but as a scheduled event. She replied with a storm that failed to produce rain. The words accused me of cruelty. The words asked how I could do this to her at a time like this. I responded with a sentence that contained no temperature. The appointment serves both of us. If the child is mine, certainty will protect us from gossip and guard our peace. If the child is not mine, the truth will guard me from a lifetime of a role I cannot play. She left the thread open and took 2 hours to reply with a single letter. I filed the exchange beneath the others. Threads only matter when they hold something up. The day of the blood draw arrived, and Harper refused. She said she would not be treated like a suspect. She said I needed to trust her. I answered that trusting science was not the same as calling anyone a liar. I told her I respected her decision and that we would proceed after birth. I informed the lab and Petra at the same time, and the lab closed the file temporarily while Petra opened a new one. She sent a letter to the hospital where Harper planned to deliver. It stated that I would not sign a birth certificate or any acknowledgement of paternity before the completion of a DNA test conducted under chain of custody. It asked that staff respect the request and call counsel if pressure arose. The hospital replied with the neutral language of institutions that have learned to avoid lawsuits. They documented the note. I slept with the first real relief I had felt in weeks. Harper began to build a story for friends and family. She told them that I had become paranoid, that the stress had turned me cruel, that pregnancy had made her vulnerable, and my suspicion had made her house unsafe. She said I was making demands that hurt the baby. I did not chase her story. I called my mother and told her only that we were expecting, and that I had asked for some time to process it, all through proper channels. My mother has survived more storms than these. She said I should eat well, and that I should attend to sleep as if it were medicine. I followed her advice and discovered again that sleep heals what speeches cannot. Work kept me anchored. I inspected a roof punched by wind into a strange drum and wrote a report that explained where water goes when you pretend it will not. I filmed a stairwell that had rotted from the inside and recorded the sound wood makes when it apologizes. I followed the discipline of note-taking that my mentors had drilled into me. Facts first, feelings later if they decide to be useful. At night, I set aside 20 minutes to review the folder labeled Chain. In it lived emails to doctors, hospital notices, lab communication, and a spreadsheet listing every expense tied to the pregnancy that had been charged to the joint account. The numbers in the sheet did not shout. They waited to be placed in front of a person in a robe who respects columns more than cries. 2 months after the announcement, I found a message on our shared tablet from a saved draft Harper had started. It was a list of items she wanted for a hospital bag, packed with brands that liked to feel important. At the bottom of the list, a single line invited a person named Colton to bring a specific snack. The snack had been mentioned once by a man at a company event I attended with Harper the previous winter. He had laughed too loudly. He had shaken my hand too long. He had introduced himself as Colton Price and bragged about closing a deal with persistence that sounded less like skill and more like stubborn luck. Memory does not always bring anger. Sometimes it brings the sound of an elevator closing, and the relief you felt then returns like a faithful pet. I did not confront her with the draft. I forwarded a copy to Petra and added a line to the spreadsheet that simply said, "Snack note, Colton name appears." Petra replied with a short instruction to continue and not to escalate. She reminded me that a draft could be the product of a ghost inside the app. I reminded myself that when you are walking a clean line, the most dangerous thing you can do is step off it to chase a detail you want to be guilty. The guilty will reveal themselves without your help if you keep the lights on and the paperwork ready. Harper spent the last weeks of pregnancy alternating between icy distance and attempts at reconciliation that felt like a pilot episode for a series that had already been canceled. I set up a small cradle near the window in the living room because I refused to punish an unborn child for the sins of any adult. I washed a stack of neutral onesies and folded them into a drawer. I learned the names of bottles and creams and ointments that claimed to tame the chaos of early life. I paid bills early and cleaned the house until it remembered what respect feels like. I told myself that whatever the DNA said, I would behave in a way my future self would thank me for. I did not know what that would look like. I only knew it would not look like a tantrum. Labor started on a Sunday afternoon when the air held a faint smell of electricity. Harper stood in the hallway and said the time had come with a face that tried to be brave, without fully believing itself. I grabbed the bag we had packed and drove us to the hospital with both hands on the wheel and both eyes open to a future that would soon declare itself. At intake, I gave the clerk my identification and the letter from Petra. The clerk thanked me and placed the letter in the chart with a motion that said, "She has done this before." We were given a room where walls whisper their own stories. Nurses moved with speed that looked like kindness. I stayed in the chair unless asked to stand and offer a hand. I was present. I was also a man sitting near a compass that would decide which continent I lived on for the next 20 years. The birth was long and then fast. A small sound entered the air and changed the gravity of the room. The nurse placed the child under a light that pretended to be a sun and performed the checks that form the first math problem of life. 5 digits on one hand, 5 on the other. Measurements that mean warmth and breath. Harper cried and then laughed and then cried again. I watched and felt deeply and held still, because holding still is sometimes the most advanced version of love. The nurse asked if I wanted to hold the child. I said I would be honored after the banding and the labels and the paperwork that protects every life in the chain. The nurse nodded with the quiet authority of someone who knows that strong emotions and strong procedures are not enemies. A tech arrived with a kit and announced the chain of custody collection for a non-invasive paternity test would be performed as noted in the chart. Identification was checked. Forms were read aloud line by line. Swabs were opened inside of the camera the hospital uses for documentation. Samples were sealed and marked and placed into a container with a tamper-evident closure. The tech read the numbers on the labels twice. Harper glared at me as if I had asked rain to fall. I kept my eyes on the container and signed where I needed to sign. The tech left with the kit, and such a heavy quiet entered the room that the machine near the bed seemed to whisper more loudly. The days that followed felt like a tightrope in wind. I changed diapers when nurses asked, and I adjusted blankets, and I stood by the window and watched a slice of city move like it had seen all this before. Harper oscillated between telling me that I was cruel and telling me that we could still be a family. We could still be a family was a sentence that arrived with the kind of optimism that tastes like fear. I responded with phrases that belonged on forms. The lab will release results to counsel. We will follow the law. I will support what the truth requires of me. She asked if I would sign the birth certificate. I said I would not sign until chain of custody produced its voice. The registrar arrived with a clipboard. The registrar left without a signature. I took a picture of the clock in the room because clocks deserve to be included when decisions are made without error. We were discharged. Harper went to her mother's for a week to recover. I returned to a house that looked like itself, only more so. A box of diapers waited near the door like a riddle. I filed the hospital papers, updated the spreadsheet, and cleaned the kitchen until it reflected the afternoon back at me. I slept, badly at first, and then with a steadiness that surprised me. The phone rang on a Thursday morning while I was inspecting a foundation that believed it was still on good terms with the soil under it. Petra's voice carried a gravity that made me step into shade. She said the lab had delivered the result and that it would be easier if I sat. I did not sit. I stood against the wall and let sun reach my shoulder at an angle that would have looked artsy in a photograph, but felt like discipline in real life. The report said 0 probability of paternity. The numbers did not insult. They simply arranged themselves into truth. Petra said we would file immediately to disestablish paternity, and that the order would move faster because we had prepared every form and annex in advance. She said we would deliver a copy to the registrar and to the hospital, and that if any record had tried to place my name in a box where it did not belong, we would erase it with the authority of the court. She said we would also file for a constructive trust to recover funds spent on the affair, which our spreadsheet presented without malice. She said I had done well. The praise did not make me taller. It made me feel like a man who had remembered to wear a seatbelt. I thanked her and ended the call, and stood still long enough to hear the insects in the grass continue their own committee. The foundation under inspection had a crack where the slab met brick. I took a photo and wrote a recommendation that would allow a skilled crew to make the line honest again. I drove back to the office and placed the report on the stack and walked out into air that felt like the first day of a season. On the way home, I stopped for groceries that would feed a single grown man for 3 days without leaving him sad. When I unlocked the door, I felt the house recognize me. Harper called from her mother's to ask what the plan was now. I told her through text that counsel would handle communication. I told her that I would cooperate with any schedule that protected a newborn human who had not asked to be assigned to an argument. I told her that I hoped Colton would accept the weight that belongs to him. She responded with a paragraph that tried to make science into a villain. I responded with the docket number for the petition and the date for the hearing. She sent a single word that looked like a door closing. The hearing arrived in a small room that has seen lives become more difficult and more simple at the same time. Petra presented the lab report in the chain of custody documentation. She attached my affidavit regarding the timeline and the hospital notices. We did not need to present emotion. The order issued with clean language. Disestablished. Name removed. No obligation for support. The judge looked at me in that way judges do when they want to see whether you intend to be aggressive or just present. I gave the exact expression I give when a roof stops leaking after a repair. Gratitude and a focus on whatever comes next. We then moved to the Constructive Trust. Petra presented the spreadsheet with charges for hotel, dining, gifts, and the designer bassinet that now felt like a symbol of a kind of hope that did not belong to me. The judge reviewed the numbers, listened to a flat explanation of policy, and granted a portion with a note about fairness. We did not win every dollar. We won enough to make the ledger honest. Petra then introduced a letter to Colton employer that requested a review of any expense reimbursements that might intersect with a relationship that affected business. The letter contained no accusation, only policy language and dates. The court did not need to weigh that matter. The letter simply entered the world with a life of its own. News travels on feet that look like shoes. Friends adjusted their seats. Family divided themselves into teams without telling me. My mother remained a team of one. She came to my house with stew that tasted like a message from a century that believes in patient work. I ate and slept and woke and went to job sites and wrote and paid and cleaned. The baby lived in another home under a sky that does not pick sides. I did not visit. I did not project resentment toward a human who had not written any of the script. When bitterness tried to rent a room in my chest, I showed it the receipt for rent paid in full by Truth, and it moved on to find another landlord. Weeks later, a letter arrived from a human resources department that had been nudged by policy. It stated that an employee matter had been reviewed and that appropriate action had been taken. It did not name names. It did not request conversation. I placed it in a folder called Outcomes and felt nothing dramatic. Accountability often arrives with a dry face. I have learned to like that face. Harper pushed for a reconciliation once after all this. She sent a message that used the language of growth and healing and turning a page. I sent a reply that used the language of boundary and legal completion and respect from a distance. She said I was cold. I said I was finished. There is a difference between heartless and complete. Complete is not a wound. Complete is a seam that lies flat and holds. I kept the house. I repainted the smallest bedroom a calm color and placed a desk under the window. I organized files so that the next time life needed to be documented, I would not lose an hour looking for a cable. I made a habit of walking before dinner and letting my feet make introductions to streets I had ignored. I learned the names of trees I had walked past for years. I learned the names of neighbors I had nodded at without hearing. I joined a pickup game of basketball on Saturdays and felt a kind of joy that carries its own air pump. People expect a man in my position to become reckless for a season. I gave them boredom instead. I went to work, came home, fixed what was broken, and called my mother on Sunday nights. I watered plants. I replaced a gasket in a faucet and felt like a king. I chose oatmeal over rage. I chose tea over revenge fantasy. The revenge that counted had already arrived in the form of paper accepted by a judge. There was nothing left to burn except my own calm, and I protected that with the same energy I once used to pursue admiration. Months passed. I woke one morning and realized I had gone a whole day without thinking about tests or courtrooms. I made coffee and stood at the window and watched light map the counter. And I felt a gratitude that stayed quiet because it had grown up. I do not need a parade. I need a roof that respects gravity and a spine that respects truth. I have both now, and I plan to keep them through the ordinary work that keeps things from sliding out of their lanes. Sometimes I drive past the building where the lab sits, and I feel a small bow rise in my chest. Not a bow to science as a god, but a bow to a craft that refuses to lie when money and fear ask it to. I think about the tech reading the labels twice and sealing the kit with steady hands. I think about the registrar who did not make me argue with her. I think about Petra, who speaks in verbs that carry cases through rooms that swallow weak language and spit out clean orders. I think about the nurse who asked if I wanted to hold the child, but also respected the process that protects children and adults from stories that cost too much to maintain. I also think of the child, not often, not as a habit that punishes me, but as a small person who did not pick any of this and deserves a life that starts with truth. I hope he grows in a home that keeps its promises most days. I hope the people raising him learn to love proof more than applause. I hope he never becomes a line in a story his mother uses to get sympathy from rooms. I hope he becomes a line in a story he tells himself when he learns that steady is a verb. I am not good or heroic. I am a man who made lists that held and followed them when the ground shifted under my feet. I asked a lab to answer a question so I would not have to pretend to answer it with a smile. I chose to build rather than to break. The house has rewarded me by becoming loyal again. The lock turns cleanly. The windows confess light without demanding flattery. The floors forgive boots. I can work with that. I can build a future on that. I am already doing it. If someone reading this stands where I stood, I offer simple counsel. Do not make a stage out of your pain. Make a file. Do not chase confessions. Let records walk in first. Eat when food is offered. Sleep even when the mind tries to audition for the role of chorus. Hire a lawyer who enjoys verbs. Choose chain of custody over kits that borrow their glamour from commercials. Do not sign a thing until truth arrives wearing a badge. When the paper lands, absorb it, obey it, and then do the humble work of making a life that does not waste what it protected. I keep the sonogram that started all this in a folder that contains no fury now. The print is only ink and shape and memory. It does not carry me away anymore. It sits there like a map that once lied to me and has since been marked with a pen that says, "Here be facts." The folder lives beside the deed to the house and a small stack of warranties for items that I can fix if they break. The sonogram is not a curse. It is a reminder that a person can choose daylight even when it arrives with the brightness of a hospital bulb. On the anniversary of the hearing, I took the day off and drove into the foothills until the road forgot that people own it. I parked and walked a trail where the air made a good argument for staying alive. I sat on a rock and ate an apple and drank water that tasted like the inside of a clean glass. I thought about how I had almost lost years to a story that did not deserve me. Then I thought about soup and smiled, because that is what free men think about on good days. I drove home with the windows cracked and the radio off. The house met me with cool air and the smell of wood and soap. The divorce finalized with less ceremony than a school play. Papers arrived by courier. I signed where Petra had placed flags in a color that suits the end of a long sentence. The courier left with a nod. I filed the copies. I made dinner. I slept. The sky did not change color, and yet something felt different in the morning, like a door had been rehung finely and would now close without complaint. I stretched my arms and felt my chest open the way it only does after the core of a problem has been addressed with real tools. People ask whether I would ever try marriage again. I say I will consider it when the answer becomes obvious, without speeches. For now I am married to practice. I am married to the idea that trouble can be met with a steady hand, and that truth arrives if you carry a clipboard and keep your mouth from pretending it can invent evidence. I am married to the idea that the future grows best in rooms where the edges are clean and the labels face forward. I keep those rooms now, and I plan to keep keeping them until someone who deserves them joins me there, if that is the road at all. On some nights, a certain sadness visits. It is not a storm. It is a fog that stands outside the window and asks if it can come in for 5 minutes. I let it in. I give it tea. I let it tell me a story about what might have been. Then I show it the folder and the order and the ledger with numbers that line up without correction. The sadness nods like a civil guest and leaves without slamming the door. I wash the cup and dry it and place it upright in the cabinet. I thank the house for allowing such ceremonies and for keeping watch when I sleep. I will not pretend that any of this made me better than other men. It made me acquainted with my own limits and my own tools. I now know which wrench to reach for when a situation rattles the way a loose pipe does. I know when to call a specialist. I know when to grab a broom. I know that quiet work saves people. It saved me. It can save others if they let it. This is not the kind of story that asks for applause. It asks for a checklist. It asks for a pen that does not run dry. It asks for a calendar that you can live inside without losing yourself. So I end here for now. The house is clean. The desk holds a stack of pages that tell the truth in the pragmatic tone of clerks. The sky over Denver behaves like a sky. The road outside carries people to lives they are trying to build. I am one of them. I tie my shoes, lock the door, and carry the key with the calm of a person who no longer fears paperwork. The future does not clap. It waits. I am on my way to meet it, with both hands free. In the months after the decree, I built a routine that kept faith with common sense. I woke at the same hour, cooked an honest breakfast, and left the dishes clean before the door closed. I walked the neighborhood and learned the squeak of a gate 2 blocks over and the time a bus exhales at the corner. I began to trust time again. Trust is not a mood. It is a ledger of small promises kept. At work, we had a run of wind claims that taught me again how structures reveal their character when stressed. Some roofs fail because of flash and edge metal neglected during sunny years. Some survive because someone who never got thanked kept caulk in the truck and pride in the craft. I wrote reports in clear language and felt useful in a way that does not need witnesses. Usefulness is a kind of prayer. I made repairs in the house as if I were apologizing to it for letting chaos borrow rooms. A door that rubbed the jamb received a plain and a whisper. Loose tiles near the entry learned obedience under new grout. I patched nail holes with patience rather than haste. The wall forgave me by forgetting. A neighbor asked if I would help him sort out a mess after a tree limb punched through his shed. We hauled debris while the son debated whether to punish or to bless. He told me about a brother who never learned to build anything he could sleep inside. We stacked lumber in neat rows, and the neatness did something to the afternoon. Order is contagious when people let it be. I found new streets to drive that let the mind rest. A service road with a view of freight trains that practice patience. A loop near the reservoir where geese argue like elected officials and still make the lake look holy. I parked and watched until the world felt less interested in my pulse. Then I went home and cooked and ate and slept. Petra sent a card at the end of the year with a short line about cases that end well when people let paper do the talking. I wrote back to thank her for the kind of guidance that does not need a stage. I included a small gift card to a coffee shop near the courthouse that serves beverages with no drama. She replied with a single sentence about the health of quiet decisions. We left it there, which felt correct. Harper reached out once more with a question about a piece of mail that had been misdirected. I forwarded a photo of the envelope and gave the tracking number. We did not discuss life or memory or regret. We behaved like two clerks with a file and a deadline. Mercy can look like that and still be mercy. I gave my mother a framed photo of the foothills for her small living room. She placed it beside a lamp that believes shadows are an art form. We ate soup, and she asked about my sleep, as if sleep were a pet she worried I might forget to feed. I told her I was doing the boring work. She said boring work raises roofs and children and men. A new hire at the office asked how to handle a difficult claimant. I told him that everyone in front of him wants three things: to be seen, to be understood, and to be told the truth. I said to deliver all three with respect, and then to write the report as if the person who reads it will have only 2 minutes and needs clarity like oxygen. He sent a thank you the next day that felt like a small payment on a debt to my own mentors. I started running at dawn on the path by the river. Every run began with a slow first mile that let the spine wake up. I learned to breathe in a way that sounded like the tide. When winter threw frost at the path, I wore layers and listened to ice complain under my soles. The body enjoyed being asked to behave. I visited a gallery one Saturday that showed landscapes painted by a hand that loved silence. The canvases looked like rooms with windows instead of walls. I stood in front of one that held a field at evening and felt the same peace I feel when a report lands clean and a client signs without argument. A guard nodded at me as if he had seen that look before. We were both at work and both fine with that. On a rain day when job sites were mud, I cleaned the toolbox that lives under the bench. I wiped each tool and let it remind me of tasks done well. I threw out the bent nails and the screws that had lost their cross. I lined up sockets in a row that invited calm. Order at the scale of a drawer teaches order at the scale of a week. I forgave Harper without sending a notice. Forgiveness is not a handshake with the other person. It is a key you return to yourself. Once I turned it, some rooms that had been locked opened and the air moved again. I used the room for reading and for sleep. Colton existed on the edge of my map, like a town I never needed to visit. I did not follow his career. When someone mentioned his name at a gathering, I let it pass like a car on a highway in another lane. The lane I chose had fewer exits and fewer billboards. It delivered me home without detours. I formed a new habit of leaving a note to myself on the counter each morning. Not motivational nonsense. A single task that, if completed, would make the day worth its keep. Replace filter. Return library book. Call a friend and ask about his mother. I completed the task and felt the house change tone by evening. I noticed birds more. A hawk that rides a thermal over the freeway at 4 each afternoon. A pair of jays that complain about everything and still find time to eat. A sparrow that survives on crumbs but carries itself like a scholar. Observing them taught me the shape of patience that does not collapse into apathy. A small accident on a job site pushed me to the clinic for a tetanus booster. The nurse asked routine questions, and I answered with gratitude for routines. She told me the world works because people do boring things on time. I agreed and went home to make a boring dinner that tasted like competence. Competence rarely trends, and yet it saves the day. When tax season arrived, I compiled documents without dread. Receipts faced the same way. Forms lived in folders named for what they are. The accountant did not have to ask me who I was. He did the math, and I wrote the check, and the year took one more step toward clean. Friends introduced me to someone at a coffee shop, and we talked without any audition. We discussed work and trails and the way rain smells on hot pavement. When she laughed, it sounded like a door that had been oiled. We exchanged first names only and then returned to our days. I felt no rush and no need to label anything as a sign. I replaced a light fixture in the hall and did the job by the book. Breaker off. Test the line. Wire nuts seated and wrapped. The new shade softened the glare, and the space felt as if it had discovered manners. I want my life to feel like that light, bright when asked and polite about it. In the months after the decree, I built a routine that kept faith with common sense. I woke at the same hour, cooked an honest breakfast, and left the dishes clean before the door closed. I walked the neighborhood and learned the squeak of a gate 2 blocks over and the time a bus exhales at the corner. I began to trust time again. Trust is not a mood. It is a ledger of small promises kept. At work, we had a run of win claims that taught me again how structures reveal their character when stressed. Some roofs fail because of flash and edge metal neglected during sunny years. Some survive because someone who never got thanked kept caulk in the truck and pride in the craft. I wrote reports in clear language and felt useful in a way that does not need witnesses. Usefulness is a kind of prayer. I made repairs in the house as if I were apologizing to it for letting chaos borrow rooms. A door that rubbed the jamb received a plain and a whisper. Loose tiles near the entry learned obedience under new grout. I patched nail holes with patience rather than haste. The wall forgave me by forgetting. A neighbor asked if I would help him sort out a mess after a tree limb punched through his shed. We hauled debris while the son debated whether to punish or to bless. He told me about a brother who never learned to build anything he could sleep inside. We stacked lumber in neat rows, and the neatness did something to the afternoon. Order is contagious when people let it be. I found new streets to drive that let the mind rest. A service road with a view of freight trains that practice patience. A loop near the reservoir, where geese argue like elected officials and still make the lake look holy. I parked and watched until the world felt less interested in my pulse. Then I went home and cooked and ate and slept. Petra sent a card at the end of the year with a short line about cases that end well when people let paper do the talking. I wrote back to thank her for the kind of guidance that does not need a stage. I included a small gift card to a coffee shop near the courthouse that serves beverages with no drama. She replied with a single sentence about the health of quiet decisions. We left it there, which felt correct. Harper reached out once more with a question about a piece of mail that had been misdirected. I forwarded a photo of the envelope and gave the tracking number. We did not discuss life or memory or regret. We behaved like two clerks with a file and a deadline. Mercy can look like that and still be mercy. I gave my mother a framed photo of the foothills for her small living room. She placed it beside a lamp that believes shadows are an art form. We ate soup, and she asked about my sleep, as if sleep were a pet she worried I might forget to feed. I told her I was doing the boring work. She said boring work raises roofs and children and men.